Speaking of Cavill Superman, I suppose we'll jump into the first film.
Man of Steel.
Which, okay, so for those who don't know or haven't seen me be an apologist in the past, I will set out my position, and Harry has yet to tell me his opinions on the films.
Connor doesn't know any of my opinions on Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, or the Justice League. And I want this to be a nice and natural reveal, so we all get his authentic response.
Yeah, and I say this with a hint of irony, for people who don't know my opinion, Man of Steel is my favourite film of all time, and I think it's objectively brilliant. So, this will be interesting. Go on. Hit me with your initial impressions.
Okay. I thought that Transformers Age of Superman is a terrible film. I really didn't like this film.
Okay, this will be interesting.
But this will be a bit of a roller coaster for you, because I do not... I will say immediately, despite you thinking it's the best film ever, I consider it easily the worst of this trilogy, and my feelings.
That's surprising.
My feelings for the other two films are not anywhere near as strong as on this one. For me, just to get it out of the way, so it's a bit clear about how I tend to appraise films. I have a hierarchy of things that I'm looking for in a film. Number one is characters. I want characters that are engaging, that have depth to them, that have interesting conflicts, both external and internal, that you can really sink your teeth into and get you invested. Because as far as I'm concerned, a good plot is only worth as much as a good character. If the plot is interesting but populated by people that I have no interest in, then I have no investment in it. Second thing is plot, because once you've got the good characters, the plot can influence how you perceive them, because, if you've got a character doing something very stupidly in the plot, purely to move the plot along, that impacts their character as well. So these two are interlinked with one another inextricably. Then number three is the just general competence of execution and the production value of it. Something doesn't need to be like ridiculously big budget to have excellent production value. You can have films that are set in a single room that have brilliant production value just because of the quality of the acting and also the shot choices and everything. And then number four is allegory and metaphor, which are very, very distant, because I think ER in his video on Us, is it? The Jordan Peele film. He has a good analogy for it, which is, plot, character, everything like that is the cake.
Paramount, and then themes are the icing.
Theme and metaphor and allegory is just the icing, and it's if a film is pure allegory, pure metaphor, unless it's intentionally done that way in like a surrealist manner, then it's not going to be anywhere near as interesting for me. But so I really didn't like this film.
Okay, I'm interested to hear why.
Just to give the praise for it straight away, I have one big point of praise, but which also ties into the criticism, and it's a point of praise and criticism that is consistent throughout all three of the films. The point of praise is Henry Cavill as Superman.
Yeah, he's perfect.
He is it's a case of perfect casting.
Yeah.
The man looks the part, he behaves the part.
He cares, which is really
He obviously
important.
cares. I do think they could do more to differentiate his persona between Clark Kent and Superman, but mainly the Clark Kent that interacts with the Daily Planet. And the fact is, we don't really get much of that throughout these films, if only because my memory of both clips I've seen from the original Superman films from the 70s and also All-Star Superman is that he changes his demeanor, he changes his posture, and he changes his mode of speaking so that it's less obvious that it's him, whereas this is one of those ones where it is a bit more distracting, that it's very obviously just Superman wearing sunglasses.
Well, so Goya and Snyder spoke
problem.
about that explicitly, because they said, and this was the mentality of why Lois Lane understands him at the end to be, well, not just at the end, obviously she knows he's Clark Kent throughout, but even if she just met him there where she'd spot him on sight, they basically said, could we have a room full of highly competent and intelligent journalists, and we have a gigantic dude walk in and just glasses make the difference? And in the world of comics, that's a wonderful, quaint little thing. But in the real world, it would be total BS.
Well, that's the thing.
And so that is fair.
Because of the overtly... it's the tone of the films, all three of these films, is trying to be more grounded than your average comic book film in terms of portraying a more realistic world. I mean, a big chunk of Man of Steel in particular is dedicated to viewing the response of the civilians and the people in the military in particular.
Well, they called it a first contact story from a social perspective.
Yes, so you do get a lot of these military men, and this is one of the reasons why I think the film really feels like a Transformers film to me, because there is a big element of we need to cut every so often to see the reactions of the military and what the military is planning to do. And the Transformers, I know it's not a particularly, I feel like there's a bit of light that's died in your eyes.
No,
with
no,
me
no, it's not
making
even
the
light. I just
comparison.
don't think it's a. The problem with the Transformers films is, yes, there's too many humans in it, but.
Well, I'm not saying the problem is that there's too many humans in this. The problem for me is that there are a lot of side characters involved in the military, like Stillwell, like the scientist whose name I can't remember, that
oh my God.
that are primarily there to...
Hamilton.
Yeah,
Professor Hamilton.
Professor Hamilton or Hamilton?
Hamilton.
Hamilton. Professor Hamilton and Stillwell, who aren't really developed at all. They don't really have many personality traits that I could grasp onto. They're mainly there to espouse exposition. And let you know where the state of the military is. And, that's a fine thing, but it does remind me a lot of the way that the Transformers films are structured.
A lot of that is taken as well from the stern John Byrne 80s era, where Superman has quite a well padded out cast.
I'm sure. I've not read those.
No, of course, no. And I'm saying if it didn't work from a story perspective, that's fine, but that's definitely the inspiration for it. I mean, for example, it literally takes the title The Man of Steel from the 60s miniseries that kicks it off.
Although they didn't keep the mullet.
That was 93, Death of Superman. That was nothing to do with that.
I thought it was immediately post-crisis
nope, it
that
wasn't.
John Byrne introduced the
mullet.
He
came back with the mullet from the Kryptonian generation chamber. And then about 2 years later, then turned into Superman Red or Blue.
That's an interesting quirk of resurrection.
Well, it's because he had accelerated growth, and also it was the 90s, but nobody liked it. So thank God we got rid of Nicolas Cage.
Billy Ray
Superman.
Cyrus was huge at the time, so it's no surprise.
Well, Superman does get his achy breaky heart split in two during Batman v Superman, but
he quite literally, quite literally. But yes, the grounded tone. Going back to what I was saying, the grounded tone of it, and the attempt to make the film a bit more realistic, even in terms of the aesthetic choices, with having a lot of shaky camera throughout it. Which is not something that I ever like. I'm not a shaky cam guy.
Other than in the scene which I really like between John Kent and Clark, where he's telling him his origins, I didn't find it that noticeable. I know it's a snap zooms a hell of a lot more.
Otherwise, but yeah, like the grounded tone that it's trying to set up makes Clark Kent just being in glasses stand out a little bit more than it would in a more cartoonish, happy-go-lucky Richard Donner style film. But that's kind of a complaint that's very consistent around people who talk about Superman versus Clark Kent, But so I've got a few my criticisms. I've got structured around some certain things. Like start off with the small things. So the aesthetics. I'm not a particularly big fan of the aesthetics of this film.
You don't like the color grading, do you?
No, and I actually think, despite what I'd been told, that Batman v Superman and Justice League both do a great deal to improve the colour grading. They are both...
I will agree with that, actually.
Yeah, they are much more colourful films. They're not necessarily more saturated. The colours do just pop a bit more, whereas I feel like this film is a little bit drab. It's very... it's not even necessarily grey. It's quite yellowy brown through a lot of it, especially the scenes set near the beginning on Krypton. And I'm not a particularly big fan of that aesthetic. And because I think I understand what he was going for. It was trying to complement the tone. But if you watch a film like Blade Runner 2049, for instance, you can set a gritty and dark tone without resorting to drastic desaturation.
But something like that is very stylized because of its
it's trying
contrast.
to go for a cyberpunk.
It's very different environment. I don't know if that's a fair comparison.
I do think it's a good example of something that is creating a grim and gritty aesthetic without having to resort to just switching all of the colours down.
I mean, I wouldn't have gone with that colour grading personally. I think I would have bumped it up a couple of tones lighter.
Yeah, just to be clear,
I don't
as
have an issue with it.
I'm not saying all of this to try and beat Connor's love of these films out of him. I'm just being honest about my opinions on these films. Before I go any further, because I don't want to drag it too far down into me just criticising this film in particular,
that's fine.
Would you like to discuss a little bit of the philosophy of the film? Because I would be interested to hear your take on it.
Well, the reason, so when you said character motivation was a problem for you, the reason I really do like this film is because of the dichotomy you have between Clark's, Cal's, Superman's, born free will as the only potential survivor of Krypton versus the Brave New World-esque, genetically predetermined I'm not going to say eco-fascism, but it's quite interesting because he is obsessed with creating a perfect environment as well as racial purity, with the inborn sort of genetically engineered killing machine that is General Zod.
I think General Zod, within the context of the universe, well, within the context of the world, does have a contextual reason to probably treasure the environment, given that his planet and the rulers of his planet are people who have gone out of their way to ecologically destroy their homeworld by overmining the core of the planet for resources. And that is one thing that I did find interesting about the film, like we discussed, that it is kind of a Plato's Republic. They're a slash socialist hellhole almost, where even the entire population is completely engineered from the ground up by the elites. You are designated a role from birth. Can you even call it conception?
No, because you're in the bladder pods. Yeah.
It's a very dystopian vision of Krypton, and I'm not that familiar with traditional depictions of Krypton myself, so I'm only going off what's in this film, and it does seem very dystopian. It seems very authoritarian. I certainly wouldn't like to have been raised from birth with the intention you're going to be a warrior, you're going to be a scientist, etc., etc. And I do think that the film does a good job of setting out that the Kryptonians are not Superman. Superman is very separate from the rest of Krypton.
Yeah, and basically
which does tie into a little bit of, like you say, his softcore Randianism, because Superman throughout this film is portrayed very much as the golden leader. He's going to be the individual against the masses, who's going to be able to lead the masses into some kind of greater tomorrow.
Yeah, he's a paragon exemplar of objective morality versus the sort of racial utilitarianism that Zod has been pre-programmed to do.
That's what Superman should be. He needs to be the example. There's the reason that the old catchphrase is truth, justice, and the American way.
Yeah.
And there are many times that, you could say the American way maybe doesn't necessarily fit in with those other two, but it's American creation, so you've got to respect that.
Well, yeah, but obviously, by the American way, they mean the rights codified in the Constitution, and that's as close to a propositional nation asserting an objective natural law morality as you're going to get. So I think American way, especially over better tomorrow, which is their new awful slogan, and this is why...
Didn't they also... Wait, no, wasn't it... Didn't they change it to... for Superman's son?
Yeah, that was better. They changed it to Better Tomorrow, and then that's why he's going on school climate strikes, which is the most despicable thing in the world.
God, I thought it was Truth, Justice. Oh yeah, it's Truth, Justice, and a Better Tomorrow. That's what it is. Yeah, which changes the ideals entirely, because it takes it, like you say, from those natural rights, those grounded, inalienable rights that Superman is there to uphold, to him basically being an instrument of regime change.
Yeah,
which isn't what he should
be.
The
long arc that bends towards justice. This kind of historicist utopian vision, which is Zod's position. It's we must reclaim Krypton. We must return to tradition. We must preserve the environment, preserve the race, even.
And this is all intentional. It's not just necessarily that Zack Snyder accidentally stumbled on it public. So it was something that was very obviously on Zack Snyder's mind.
Yeah, it was a genetically determined version of the metallurgic society that Plato proposes in Republic. And obviously Krypton is governed by philosopher kings. I mean, he said that their aesthetic was based on the 60s Planet of the Apes movies, so...
I actually did recently, for the first time ever, watch the original Planet of the Apes from the 1960s. I don't necessarily get that vibe.
Well, that's what he said in his director's watch-along, so he said that was one of the sources that they did for that. But the idea is that the society cannot be rationally ordered or controlled because it will always degenerate. But the most interesting thing is, as well, obviously, Nietzsche progenited the term Übermensch, and the original idea behind Superman was how the will to power can corrupt humanity. So the original Superman story was Reign of the Supermen, and it had a character called, I believe his name is David Dunn, which is why the name was used in Unbreakable, funnily enough. And he was a homeless man who was taken by a mad scientist and given telekinetic powers, and he was meant to be Superman. And he killed the scientist and then went to destroy the world, and then his brain burned out. And it was meant to be that if you try to do the will to power, it will corrupt you from within. The interesting thing about Jor-El that I found is there's this strange contradiction of how can a scientist who's genetically predetermined to preserve Krypton's racial purity in the planet have come up with the idea of having a free birth in the first place, because it should be outside his code. But in the same way that Nietzsche said the seeds of destruction for Christianity germinated within the philosophy, I think it is, if you're trying to make a perfectible scientific ideal, you're going to have it self-criticize itself and come out with the only solution being a sort of atheism against science. And that's why we're sort of seeing a distrust of the experts in contemporary day. But this is why Jor-El went, well, the only way to get out of this downslide into planetary destruction is to buck the trend of genetic determinism, have a normal birth. And from nihilism comes the Superman. And I just found that quite to be an interesting dichotomy that Snyder set up.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.